There she sits, Queen Mary, and reminds us of a blind spot in our history. The white gold, sugar, and what it meant of big riches for the very few, and the big toil and misery for the many, of which she was a symbol. This is the story of sugar and how it left its mark on Copenhagen. We have to start on the other side of the Atlantic, though, where in the West Indies various European countries had been competing for land before Denmark, almost by accident, stumbled into the sugar trade. It began with a war between the two leading naval nations of the time, the British and the Dutch, and with the introduction of the Navigation Act that excluded foreigners from trading to the British Isles, which, of course, hit the Dutch most. Seen from the West Indies, however, this was a London versus Amsterdam thing, and it ignored the realities on the ground. It was important for the islands that they could trade between each other, but the Navigation Act made that impossible. So, an envoy was sent by the islanders, primarily the Dutch, to go around various other European countries to see who they could persuade to enter the fray. Both the Brandenburgers and the Swedes declined, but Denmark saw an opportunity and sent an expedition to occupy the uninhabited St. Thomas that normally were under Spanish rule, but they were not in position to actually defend it. The island that we today call the US Virgin Islands, but back then was the Danish West Indies. Just like the British and the Dutch, it was decided not to run the territory directly, but instead set up a company, the Danish West Indian Company, that was founded in 1677 to actually run the business. The king suggested to the leading people of the times that they should invest in the company, and in a time of absolutism, when the king suggests something, you do it. Chief among the most influential people to invest in the company were the king's half-brother Ulrik Frederik Gyldenløve and his queen Charlotte Amalie. Both combined put up about a sixth of the total capital of the company. Gyldenløve built this palace for himself and later sold it to the Queen Dowager, and it's named after her. You will also recognize her name, Charlotte Amalie, because it is the name of the capital of the Virgin Islands. After selling Charlottenborg, Gyldenløve built this new palace named after him, and it's here that his son Ferdinand Anton Daneskov Laurvig was born, and he in 1723 became president of the Danish West Indian Company. Originally set up to be the trading company that could link the Dutch and the British colonies in the Caribbean, it quickly became apparent that if you really want to make money, you had to engage in sugar. Both St. Thomas and later St. John were both too small and too hilly to be really viable as a sugar production area, so the company was on the lookout for another island, and the opportunity came in 1733. Because France, fearing yet another war with Britain, realized that they could defend St. Croix, and rather than having it being seized by the British, they preferred to sell it to a friendly nation. It's an odd fact, but France and Denmark has never been at war with each other. St. Croix was better suited for sugar production, but it lacked a deep-sea harbor. St. Thomas, however, had a deep-sea harbor, so it became customary that they shipped the sugar in small boats from St. Croix to St. Thomas to reload it into the ocean-going vessels. This trade became such an important part of St. Thomas that it was declared a free port in 1764 and has remained as such ever since. The business model of the West Indian Company was to have a monopoly on the transatlantic trade, and this meant that the islanders had to buy and sell all their goods through the company. It even went so far as to prohibit the refining of sugar on the islands, so they had to export either as molasses or raw sugar. Since the company was unable to keep up with the demand, they had to ease some of their restrictions, and for instance the slave trade was given over to other companies. And yes, the slaves were treated as a commodity. Outrageous that it might seem, just think about modern business economy treat employees as an expense and not as an asset. With time, it became apparent that a private company is unsuited to be a territorial power, and in 1755 the islands became a crown colony and the company was dissolved, with the state taking over all of its assets. The monopoly, however, persisted. It just now belonged to the state, and they built this warehouse for the commodities going to and fro the islands. The company assets were sold off, and one of the big buyers was Heinrich Karl Schimmelmann, who just happened to be the chancellor, and he bought the plantations on the islands, and he also bought the company's refinery in Copenhagen. In 1762, the family moved into this fine building, and it was from here that the son, Ernst Heinrich, who also happened to be a chancellor, oversaw the family businesses. He was a prime mover in the abandonment of the slave trade, although with a transition period of 10 years, other events overtook the decision. Although Schimmelmann had the largest refinery, he was by no means alone. For instance, Heinrich had not only one but two refineries, which made him an important man in the sugar business too. His tombstone features a beehive, not only to symbolize his business acumen, but also the fact that he was in the sugar trade. When he died without an heir, he left his fortune, which was a pretty penny, to the city's hospitals and their social institutions. The catastrophe that hit Denmark and the sugar industry was the Napoleonic Wars. Denmark lost its fleet, and the islands were briefly occupied by the British. More importantly, the British also put an embargo on the whole of the continent. Cut off from the deliveries from the West Indies, France had to develop a new way of producing sugar, and the answer was sugar beet. Sugar beet has several advantages over sugar cane. It can be grown locally, and it did not need slaves. With the island's economy now in ruins, it was time to do something about the abomination of slavery. The governor, Peter von Scholten, facing another rebellion, decided that the best way of dealing with it was simply to release all the slaves. He did so, however, without consulting his superiors, so he was recalled, tried, and stripped of all his offices. But the authorities faced the dilemma of what to do about his decision and decided that the end of slavery was a fait accompli. With the sugar industry now relying on sugar beet, the factories moved out into the fields, and the refineries in Copenhagen closed down one by one. The last one standing was Phoenix, which is named so because it was rebuilt after a fire, and it is today the national headquarters of the only sugar-producing company still operating in Denmark, the German company Nordzucker. And thus ends 300 years of sugar production in Copenhagen, a production that has left precious little of the factories, but quite a bit of the riches that derive from their production.